So instead of leadership is kind of standing on the shoulders of their predecessors and taking their remediation to the next level, they're kind of getting stalled for some of these kinds of reasons. You mentioned turnover, and I know in my experience, when we had a new CISO come in from a different type of organization, because of the nature of the business itself, there's a different focus. Like you've mentioned, regulatory or other kinds of banking laws and things like that. I came from a manufacturing organization, so to completely change the approach can be, I would think, very disruptive. So what are some of the causes of the turnover? Have you had any opportunity to kind of look and see why there's so much change in some of these roles?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think it goes a little bit to the senior executives and the board as well, because I think
Hmm.
understanding that risk or security is like a risk preventer or risk reducer, right? In terms of really trying to say that, hey, there will be a zero tolerance for risk and kind of address it from that perspective. So, in my opinion, if one um, breach occurs, if the breach occurred because of the negligence of the company, I can see that some of the later, some of the recent CISOs have gotten fired because of that, right? But there are
Hmm.
sometimes CISOs are doing all the right things and the right activities, but things happen, and we have seen that in some instances where it was not the negligence, but it was just things happen. But I think that maybe the board or the executive sometimes don't understand, and the CISO becomes the scapegoat that, hey, look, incident occurred, and therefore they were let go. But in my opinion, that's just one reason. The other reasons are that CISO are in just so much demand right now. It's probably the hottest job which is out there, and they are getting aggressively pursued by the recruiters.
Yeah.
For maybe sometimes twice the salary they're making. So it is easier to see why they leave one instance and goes to another, go to the another organization.
Great point. And I think I've never run an information security program. I've certainly assessed them as leading the global IT audit in my organization. But when I led risk management, one of the key things was to make sure that we had ownership for all the applicable areas of responsibility across the world, which can be very, very difficult. And just one person kind of dropping the ball can be that weak link in the chain. And so when it comes to information security, for example, a weak link in the chain becomes the avenue for an insider or a third-party outsider coming into the network, coming into the applications, getting at the data and things like that. So it's important that everybody work together. And sometimes the CISOs are held accountable for weaknesses that have occurred in other parts of the organization.
You're
Some of the
absolutely correct.
CISOs, in fact, have a very small staff to work with.
Right. And I think, Jay, just one other point is that I'm seeing that a lot of these CISOs, if they have the executive support and commitment, then, if an incident happens where there is nobody else's fault or no negligence, I think then the senior management understands and supports the CISO. But I think those areas where the CISO is kind of in the middle management and the senior executives don't have that visibility of what CISO does on a day-to-day basis, that's where I think the risk is that if a incident occurs, even though it's not a negligent risk, that CISO role gets in jeopardy.
It's a great point. And there's a lot of debate about where CISOs should report in the organization. Obviously, a CEO can't have too many direct reports because that's not effective either. And the CIO is responsible oftentimes for hiring the CISO. And some of the board members that I talk to tell me that the CIO needs to be technically skilled, otherwise they're not going to be selecting the right chief information security officer to report to them, and the whole program can collapse based on that. Which brings up the issue of skills and experience and technical knowledge. How important is that around making sure that there's follow through on these implementation plans, these remediation plans?
I think I think each organization kind of looks at the role of a CISO a little differently and depends on the maturity level of that organization. I view it from the three different perspectives. The security program has to address activities in three major areas: governance, risk, and compliance, right? So if the internal audit department, for example, from an IT perspective is strong, they could do quite a bit of work and assist the security officer from a compliance perspective, for example, right? Or maybe some of the activities in the governance side. If the IT organization is strong, where they can address some of the risk area themselves, that's I'm not sure if the viewers are familiar with the IIA's 3 layers of defense. You know, the first line of defense is always the management. And if the management is doing all the right work, then the CISO can act more like the governance arm, which is the second layer of defense. And then the internal audit can play that third layer of a third line of defense. So if that is true in a mature organization, then all 3 angles work very well. But in some organizations, the security officer is playing the governance role, the risk role, and maybe partially the compliance role. And that becomes a little harder for them. So I think from the understanding that what role they're going to play in an organization, then that skill level varies. In some cases, the security officer has to be very technical because they need to perform some of the risk side of things, whereas other places, the governance plays a key role, and that's where they need to be skilled in.
Mm-hmm. So it really depends on the organization itself and what their needs are, and that'll drive the kinds of skills and experiences that a CISO or technical security people need to have. Completely understand that. And I really like your point too about sometimes these other departments play other roles depending on where there are gaps in the skills and experience of the team. Early on in the company, in the IT audit, clearly I felt as an internal audit leader that sometimes I was leading the compliance function for IT security because that didn't exist very much in the organization itself. So that was something that we built up over time. I would have to do these foundational reviews to show where the major gaps were, going back to your earlier point about starting with that foundation and building on that. So even in a major global $150 billion company, these kinds of things can happen if the right people aren't put in place. So
Definitely.
great point.